I've been involved with the AIDS Memorial Quilt for over 20 years. The AIDS Memorial Quilt is the largest piece of community folk art in the entire world. What it is a memorial to people who have died of HIV and AIDS-related issues. It's pieces of fabric sewn together representing lives. These were actual people with names. And we wrap them in this caring piece of fabric to let them know that they matter and that we care for them. The very first phone call that I had when the quilt moved from San Francisco to Atlanta was of a young black man who hosted a quilt display at Eastern Carolina University. He wanted to get information about returning his quilt. And he said to me reluctantly, "The next time we do this, can you make sure they don't just send us a whole bunch of old white dudes?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, sure." And then I got off the phone with him and I looked into the database and I looked at the quilt that we sent to him, and it was a bunch of old white guys. So schools and museums and hospitals, and particularly universities that would put on these large quilt displays, wanted to have quilt that represented their community, their student body. I think the quilt was about 55 miles long from end to end, and a half a mile was dedicated to African Americans. There weren't that many, and those were the ones that were always out on display. And so it was always this tug of war with display hosts. Who's going to get the black quilt this year? And we simply didn't have enough to meet the demand, and we certainly didn't have enough to represent the numbers that were coming out from the CDC of who was being most infected and affected by HIV and AIDS. Call My Name is a project that was started here in Atlanta to fill that void, to get more African Americans to be memorialized as part of the quilt. The name is a Maya Angelou quote, and it's also something that's part of the African American tradition, is to call the name of your loved ones, call the names of your ancestors. And so that's where the name comes from. We want people to call their names, to not let the memory of their loved one be one of guilt and shame, that you can actually say, they existed. They exist through me, but they were living people who mattered. And it's okay to call their name. It can be enormously therapeutic to make a panel. You see that just simply from the outpouring of emotion that happens when people are finally able to tell a story that they've kept secret, about their brother, their aunt, their sister, the teenagers in particular, who come to us after a quilt display and want to tell their story. One of the stories that is most often connected with the quilt is my uncle. And they'll talk in whispers to us. Is there some way that I can participate with this? No one in my family talks about this. And we find, yes, there's a safe space for you. Making a panel can be very cathartic because it's been cathartic for me. My childhood best friend, he passed of HIV and AIDS. I mean, the depth of grief that I had, because I didn't go to a funeral, didn't know he had passed for, such a long time, and didn't get to say goodbye. And this was pre the the internet digital age of being able to get somebody's photograph digitally. So it was almost as if he was never here. And when I knew I had an opportunity to make a panel for him, it was allowed for me to, one, acknowledge, that this person was a person, and for me to go through the grieving process that may take a while. I get emotional just thinking about it. I started Call My Name somewhere around 2008. Atlanta is a majority African American city. So just starting quilting workshops in and of itself, you're going to be reaching out to this community. And so it just kind of grew out of that. It's overwhelmingly women who come into our workshops. It's much easier with women because that tactile part of putting together material is something that is very female related, just traditionally. A lot of times when we'll do a quilt workshop, the men will walk by and we have to pull them in or invite them in, and actually telling them, we want you here. That's one of the ways we get people, more men involved, is we try to meet them where they are. I do many workshops at testing facilities. And so someone may have an appointment and they're coming in to get tested. And as they're walking in the hallway, they see us in the side room and they peek in and want to know what's going on, and we invite them in. They say, well, I just came, I didn't really come for this. And we'll say, well, when you're finished, come back by. And we'll explain to them what they're doing, and their eyes will light up, and we'll say, just put a stitch in. Because all the quilt is not just sewing. You can paint, you can draw, you can sign your name, you can use a marker. There's so many ways that you can participate in forming a panel. So it's simply a matter of invitation. There's a panel that the quilt received, I think in 1987. It's called The Last One, because there was the thought that this pandemic would be over. So it is my hope and desire that we could finally sew that last panel in and close this chapter, because there's no reason, there's no one born in this 21st century who should end up on this quilt. We ought to be able to sew in the last one and say that this is the story of the age of AIDS and put a button in it.